Very warm greetings from Colombo, Sri Lanka. Very warm greetings from the Education Forum Sri Lanka. This is a very special discussion we are having today in the backdrop of the COVID education catastrophe. So today's discussion is going to focus on education emergencies and the preparedness of our different countries and the world on facing education emergencies, using the COVID catastrophe as a backdrop, learning lessons from it, and futuristically thinking forward. We have an extremely eminent panel with us from the Western part of the world. We have from Canada, we have Gareth Manning, and then we have from Argentina, Silvina Ritz. We have from London, UK, Katya Saville. All of these I'm going to introduce in greater detail before they speak. Professor Oplatka from Tel Aviv in Israel. And we have Baila Jamil from Pakistan. So we have a very wide array of experiences, interests, and a highly educated, eminent panel before us. I'd just like to set context before we initiate the discussion and before our panelists begin. The topic is obviously very timely, very relevant for the reasons I mentioned. We are in the midst of yet an unfolding COVID-19 pandemic, a catastrophe, which started as a public health catastrophe, as everybody knows, but within weeks, or rather months, it manifested into an economic catastrophe. And silently but surely, an education catastrophe was unfolding almost at the same time, but the education catastrophe was largely underappreciated, neglected, or sometimes even ignored. So I always try to look at this tri-catastrophes as a tripod with 3 legs, without which the tripod seat can't stand. Of course, the first leg, or one important leg, being the health catastrophe, the public health crisis, the economic crisis, and the third leg of the tripod being the education crisis. So all 3 are equally important, although, like I mentioned earlier, the education catastrophe, what we are going to talk about today and our preparedness for it in the future, is the one that has been almost relegated into a lower rung of the degree of priorities we are dealing with. I think we all know that in March 2020, for the first time since World War II, all the schools across the world in 192 countries abruptly shut, throwing out of in-person, face-to-face, real physical education, something like nearly 1.7 billion students from physical school to almost no education. What happened was that there was a kind of a perception, which is actually not quite correct. The perception was that this entire group of students who were thrown out of school actually seamlessly went into online education or virtual education or internet-based education. Then again, when things unfolded, all of us in our countries and those across the world began to realize that actually it was only a percentage of these students who were in the category of physical in-person school that went seamlessly into online education. And in fact, it was a very small percentage that had that transition smoothly, swiftly, and uninterruptedly. So the greater number of students actually went into a space where there was no education at all. They were confined to school, confined to their homes without an education. The Worldwide Commission on Education, Educating Children Post-Pandemic, is a global entity which began in January 2021, comprising of some 50 countries or more. Some of our panel members are members of that commission as well, recognize this major situation, the major catastrophic situation, as 3 buckets. The first bucket being the physical, in-person, face-to-face schooling that all children went through. And then the second bucket being the online or virtual school that some of them were thrown into, which we assumed was quite seamless in most cases, but we were wrong. And then we had the third bucket, kids, which has now become a very graphic and a very commonly used nomenclature. The third bucket kids are the children who have been left without a school, without an education, online or otherwise. So currently the Worldwide Commission is discussing about reintegrating these students in the third bucket into either bucket, first or second, and the methodology of doing that, and the catastrophic consequences that can be expected if they are not reintegrated into some form of education. So that's the background. Now, I just want to set context a little further by asking, reflecting on it and posing the question to our panelists about whether this pandemic actually offered any benefits at all. I see certain benefits within quotes that the pandemic offered. One is that it exposed the universal unpreparedness to face education emergencies, and that's a very serious matter. Across the board, rich to poor, middle income to upper income, or to the lower income countries, every single country actually was completely unprepared to face the catastrophe when it came our way last year. The second benefit it did is it exposed the massive inequities in education. As usual, the kids at the bottom of the pyramid, socioeconomically or in terms of learning, got pushed further down in that pyramid. So the inequities got worse. And of course, it exposed a huge digital divide that we have. And that is why the first bucket kids, all of them did not go into the second bucket, although we assume, or there is still a perception that they are there, but they are not. So the aim of today's discussion, therefore, is to have an understanding and to acknowledge the universal unpreparedness that all our countries and more have been facing and are facing in terms of education emergency. No one was fully prepared, like I mentioned earlier. Even high income, affluent, privileged countries, small nations like Singapore, even they took time to shift to online education. The second aim of this discussion is to again appreciate and understand this pandemic. This is not the last one we are going to have. If it's not a pandemic created by a pathogen, it will be something else. So this is not the first and the last catastrophe in education we are going to face. So hence the importance of understanding the necessity for preparedness. The third point that I'd like to reflect on and to place before our panelists and our audience is the necessity for systems upgrading, for the necessity for institutionalized strengthening in order to face a future catastrophe. Because all our countries, all our education systems, I think there's a vacuum in terms of institutionalizing the preparedness for education emergencies. Of course, no one size fits all. Countries differ economically, socially, and in so many other ways. But can we just discuss, can we have an open mind and discuss how best we can learn from each other, how the better performing countries can share their experiences with the others? So very basically, that's the context I want to set. We are going to start with our 5 panelists. A very eminent group whom I will introduce one at a time before they speak. They will take approximately 12 to 15 minutes each. I would appeal to you to please stick to your time, because at the end of 1 hour, we will be completing the panel discussion, after which what we would like to do is actually engage the audience in an open discussion. I would like to have opinions expressed, comments made, and various other experiences shared. So in that context, I think that is where I will pause at this moment. The discussion will be followed up by a summing up and a conclusion, which my colleague, Dr. Sujata Gamage, will actually lead the sum up and the conclusion. And we will like to invite everyone to participate in the discussion when we open it out at the end of the panelists. So with that, I'd like to start with our first very eminent panelist. She's Dr. Silvina Witz. I only hope I'm pronouncing your name again, Silvina. She's a PhD in education. She's a professor of the University of St. Martin. She's a researcher at the National Council of Science and Technology of Argentina, a fellow of the Guggenheim Foundation. She has already published 24 books, many articles. The last one is published this year in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia on Education. She was formerly the Minister of Education of the province of Buenos Aires, and now she's the Secretary of Education of the city of La Matanza. With that, very warmly, I'd like to invite Silvina to take the next 15 minutes or so to make her presentation. Over to you.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much, Tara, and all the colleagues from Sri Lanka for this invitation. I really appreciate it. So thank you very much. And I want to say that I'm very proud to share this panel with these very important colleagues from all around the world. Saying that, I'm going to start talking a bit about the situation of this of the educational system in Argentina and some of Latin America, but mostly, and also the second part, I want to talk about the future of the educational systems and how do we have to think about new strategies for the future of educational systems. So let me start by saying that in Argentina, we are more than 47 million inhabitants. We have 11 million students and almost 1 million teachers or professors. So in order to know a bit about the scale in Argentina, because I think really scale has to do with strategies in policies. I mean, you cannot do the same strategy when you're talking about 3 million inhabitants, when you're talking about 40 millions, or when you talk about 300 millions. So we are in this, I mean, we have this 11 million students. We are a middle income country. And now the situation, it is getting worse in Argentina. We have 80,000 people who died from COVID, even though we are having now almost 20 million vaccines. Still, the situation, it is very, I mean, it is really worse. It is really horrible in Argentina, and especially in urban areas. So these urban areas are having or hybrid school or virtual or distance schools. Rural areas, sometimes they're having presential schools. So I mean, you cannot talk about the country as a whole or as a unity, because it is a huge country geographically speaking. But in the main areas, in the main urban areas, there is a huge discussion in between having a virtual or distance school or hybrid school. And it is a problem because the main region, that we call it AMBA, that it is the region where the virus is circulating, it has politically two main like provinces or states. One is the city of Buenos Aires, who are willing, I mean, the government of the city wants to have hybrid school or presential school, and the province of Buenos Aires who decided not to have a hybrid school, but virtual or distance schools. But the virus does not recognize political limits. So we're in the middle of a problem that it is really, a need to be solved. The second part second thing I wanna tell is that when we talk about this second bucket, Tara, that you mentioned before, the second bucket kids that are in virtual schools in developing countries, we need to talk about part virtual and part distance schools, which it is not the same, because in Argentina, 20% of the students, they have the possibility of synchronic education, meaning they have high-speed internet and they have a device for themselves. But the rest of the 80% of the children and the country has or asynchronic education through WhatsApp or through Facebook, 60%, and then you have a 20% that only can get in touch with the teachers when each 15 days they go to the schools to take some like food to their homes, because they are poor, because they are sometimes starving. And in those, in those days, they like share like some, some meaning tasks, or some, they share something with their teachers, not mostly the kids, but mostly the parents of the kids, or the family, or the significant others of those kids. But it is only one each 15 days that they have any contact with the school. And then you have the third bucket kids, which is even worse, because we have almost 1 million students that lost contact with the school. So this is the situation, and we need to, get better with this situation. As Tara said, I mean, we need the necessity of strengthening of the educational systems. And I think we need to recognize the inequity of education in between, not only inside the countries, but in between countries itself. For example, a country nearby Argentina, that is Uruguay, they do have connectivity and they do have a device given by the state. So each kid has at least one, one computer. In Argentina, for example, in my city, we gave books to the kids. I mean, math books, language books, or Spanish books, and social, but not all the kids in Argentina even have books to study. And we also gave them like papers and pencils and colors to work, because the poverty is getting worse each day. We have more than 50% of the children that are under the level of poverty in Argentina because of the pandemic now. So we need to do as much as possible to help them to have the material for studying. Okay, saying that, I want to talk about the future of education, and I really think we need to rethink about the future of education. First of all, we need to do some policies that are well known for all of us. That means technological infrastructure for all the kids. I mean, we really need to work in technological infrastructure. One device for each kid, and connectivity if possible, but at least with one device that can have the contents and everything, it'll be a great thing for improving the educational systems. I also think we need to work on connectivity, but it'll take a bit more time because I mean, we don't have in some places the basic infrastructure. It is not a problem to buy the connectivity. It is a problem that there's no connectivity at all for anyone in some parts of the country. So also, I think for the future, we need to give all the kids books because printed material is as important as electronic devices. But then we do not have to be like nostalgic or thinking that, okay, when we had presential school, everything was okay, because everything was not okay. And we need to think about a reorganizing, especially on secondary school in Argentina at least, to think which are the most important contents we want or we need to teach. For example, everybody says that, or somebody says, kids are digital natives. Well, they are not. They have a better instrumental managing of technology, but instrumental managing of technology does not mean at all that they know what like a digital print is, what means like free software, like the difference in between private software and like free software. They do not know what is big data. They do not know anything about this new economy, like blockchains are bringing to us. They do not know what is a crypto money, and there are many. They do not know how to program, for example. So they are always depending on others to do this kind of work, or when they have to think about software, they depend on buying software from others. And at the same time, in the world, there is a free software that it is great for educational kids and for working also. And I think we need to think about like, I don't know, but think about which are the contents that are more useful for our 21st century kids in general. I mean, and I think we need to think about a reorganizing of at least secondary school in most Latin America. So when Tara, you talk about the benefits or opportunities that this pandemic can offer, I think one is reorganizing of schooling. So thank you very much to all of you. It is a pleasure to share this panel.
Thank you very much, Silvina. And I am particularly pleased that you highlighted the necessity for our systems strengthening, the education systems, the institutionalized strengthening, and the education infrastructure, which includes all the devices and the connectivity, as you mentioned. Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. I'm now going on to invite Professor Iza Oplatka. He's a professor of educational administration and leadership at the School of Education in Tel Aviv University, Israel. Professor Oplatka's research focuses on the lives and career of school teachers and principals, educational marketing, emotions, and educational administration, and the foundations of educational administration as a field of study. His most recent books include Reforming Education in Developing Countries, published in 2019. With that, over to you, Professor Platka. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here with you on this weekend. I would like to share. Can I share my slides? My PowerPoint? Yes.
Please do, yeah.
Can you hear? Can you see?
Yes.
Can you see the slides? Okay, so okay, great. If you can see, it's also in Toronto, so I'm okay with this. Okay, I would like to talk in the 50 minutes I've received. I would like to talk about the policy level of this crisis, of the Corona crisis. And as you can see from the next slide, let me press here. Yeah, from the next slide, we're talking about a year and 2 months only since this pandemic became part of our life. It's only a year and 2 months, but it's a huge time for all of us, okay? Globally, you mentioned before, Tara, that this is a global issue. Yes, it is. So let's go back to March, April 20. This was the first closure of schools in Israel, and I think in many other countries in the world, okay? Suddenly, out of the blue, I remember the first day I went to my university, it was the first day of our second term. And then I realized I was the only one there because the students refused to attend the university. They heard about this gruesome pandemic, so they didn't want to be part of the university. So the first response was shock. And you know, the policymakers, they are not so as effective as we would like them to be. But when they are shocked or in times of crisis, their ineffectiveness is more prominent. So this was shock. There were many difficulties. What about unprivileged students? Not enough computers. So when I go back to these days, people didn't know what to do, let alone in the educational system. So the school closed, there was a lockdown. And then after 2 months, we thought, okay, everything is okay now. We can get out of our homes and be with other people again. And then the summer vacation arrived, okay? So, you know, the school year, we have the school year and we have the vacations all over the world. So people said, okay, what will be next year? The pandemic is still here with us. Yeah, it is. Let's think about this year as a special year. And who thought about it? The policymakers in the educational system. They can be the minister, they can be the general officers and the superintendents. And then came September. September 1 is the first day of our school year, and school attendance, as in the pre-corona time, skills must attend school. So no pandemic will prevent it. The problem was that the students must attend school, but they will increase the levels of the corona in the country. This is not a secret that they are not going to be affected very much by the pandemic, but probably their grandfathers and mothers and fathers. So at the end of September 2020, there was another lockdown. At these times, the educational system had been blamed for that. This is only because schools. Oh, and there is and later on, there was another lockdown, but it was not as tight as the previous ones. And now, to end the good story, in Israel, we have less than 20 cases each day. And I don't remember who was the one person who died because of corona. I can't remember now. So we have the good thing because 70% of our adult population has been vaccinated so far. So it means that we got what we call the herd vaccine. Okay, we no longer have the corona here as we got used to. So let's go back again. What happened with the policy? What happened to the policy? Because Tara, you wanted us to talk about the future, but we can't talk about the future without the past. And this past is so close to us, so we can all remember, and I'm sure you will find some commonalities, some similarities to what happened in your location, in your countries. So during the corona crisis, after the first lockout, one of I think it was the Minister of Education or one of the officials that said it is important to open schools, at least because each day in which the students out of school cost $800,000. So it was probably someone who said it from the Ministry of Treasury. So the school year will be different. That's what they said a year ago, not a year ago, but 8 months ago, before the school year began. So they said this year will be based on Zoom, but not only Zoom. School attendance will be in small groups of 18 children. Why 18? I don't know, but this is the responsibility of the physicians, of the Ministry of Health, not us. And they said, but we need different solution for different places. I wouldn't say places, I wouldn't see groups of students. So they said, no, not special education. You can't leave kids with the special needs at home too much. And you can leave students at risk at home too much. And but when you look at the whole picture, it was such a big mess. It was such a confusion, a lack of organization, a lack of clear policy. Maybe because the human being is constrained to the routine. Maybe because we are limited in our ability to face crises. I don't know. But what was this view? The view was differential. They said, oh, kindergarten, they can go. Why? Because the Ministry of Health say, I don't know if they are influenced and influence others in this pandemic, if they are contagious, okay? So then they say 3 days, the first and second graders will go to school and the others part of the class will be in the other days. And then they said, yeah, but 3 and 4th graders, they will be only 18 kids in the class and the others will use Zoom. But then came the public criticism. So the people say, but kids need kids. How can you leave them at home? We get crazy. You know, and we have some families that are very large, at least in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish or in some Muslim communities, they have many kids at home, so it's a problem. So Zoom, also they decided Zoom plus 2 days. Now I'm talking in this way, and you can feel and you can feel my cynical tone in my voice, okay? Because this is cynical, you know. After all, it was like a trial and error and trial all the time. So 2 meters between kids, special agreements for teachers. Teachers have been afraid. We don't want to be sick. They are right, by the way, okay? But who can ask students to be 2 meters from the teacher? After all, we all want after all, teaching is an emotional practice. So how can you practice your emotions and tell people, don't get close to me? Kids, small kids, don't get close to me. You are contagious. You are a danger. Okay, you are dangerous. So it's ridiculous after all. If you think about it, you can't tell kids, hey, keep away from me. It's not. This is not a classroom, okay? Especially not in elementary school system, the primary school system. So let's see what happened. So then people in the Ministry of Education, in the municipality, in the LEAs, what we call it in England, LEAs, local education authorities. So they started to say, oh, but we have not enough softwares. Oh, the government will allocate soon some budget to buy softwares. Okay, but what about digital contents? We can't develop it so fast. So what the teachers have done, they stick to the curriculum as if they are in the classroom, okay? So they kept teaching as if they're in the classroom, but they are not in the classroom. So how can they teach from the, you know, it's different. We can't. I always I've always told my students that I will teach and then give them some assignments, something that I've never done before in the university, in the campus, okay? Because I don't think they can listen via the Zoom 90 minutes with no breaks. In-service trainings, it didn't work out this part, of course. Okay, let's absorb other 13,000 teachers, okay? Instructional assistants, why? Because if you divide the class into 2 groups, so you need an assistant. Oh, what a mess, because they hired people that say, let's say in a very gentle way, or in a very politically correct way, unsuitable to work with kids. Because if you hire many people very fast, some of them will be unsuitable. Digital systems, but many children have no computers. The infrastructure in many villages, okay, simply don't work. okay? Upgrading computers in school because many computers are old because no one before have invested too much in computers, especially not in the poor areas, maybe in the best area, in the rich areas, okay? Lending laptops. Let's start, we buy, the government bought many laptops, but there are no laptops because all the government in the world wanted to buy laptops, okay? At least for the middle class kids. So this was a collapse. And people say, no, back to the Zoom. September, the higher levels of Corona, a crisis, the government can't handle it. And the kids are there to blame them because they cannot answer, they cannot defend themselves. So what's going on here? Let's go, dramatic increase. We are closing. And then came people like me and who said, Zoom simply not working. Okay, I had a chance during the Corona to write so many journal articles in the newspapers, not in refereed papers. Okay, so it's easier. You send, and the day after it is published. You know. So okay, this is no reviewing. So we say, look, I'm not going to read all of these, but you can see it's ineffective. Rich people hire tutors, okay, for their kids. Others don't know what to do with the Zoom. Parents don't. An increase in latent dropout, especially among disadvantaged students. But you know that every crisis, and Tara, you said something about it in your introduction, every crisis brings with it some latent capabilities, some hidden skills that the principals, the education editors have never realized they had. So afterwards, there was a criticism and criticism and criticism because Israel is a democracy, so people could, raise their criticism. So children attended the kindergartens again and special education, but the principals, and this was something genius, they decided to extend the formal definitions of those students who could attend the schools. Okay, so many of them told me, because I am in my town, I'm a city councillor who is responsible voluntarily over the educational system. So they said, don't say a word, but we have decided to call all at-risk students to attend the school, even though the government prohibits that, even though the Ministry of Health prohibits that. They said they can come. They are under the umbrella of the students with special needs. So this is something that is so beautiful in education, because after all, education is not a profession, this is a craft, okay? This is something that we can define the borders of it as we want. There is no strict line of what is education and what is not education, what is unprivileged students and what is not. So they have started to bring up very innovative ideas that many of them evident that they said, we have never thought about it before, but the crisis forced us to be innovative. I don't know how much time I have, so you will let me, okay? Let me know if I... So what were the challenges of the teachers? After all, they have to challenge what we call a lack of educate resources for online learning. It's different. It's different. You need very evocative tasks, evocative assignments, because the children behind the screen is not the children who sits in the class, because the classroom has a different atmosphere. It's an emotional embedded. It is filled with many stimuli. Okay, so this is a different atmosphere. But when you sit on the screen, first, what all of us know, when the more time we are looking at the screen, the more the tired we are. Okay, and our eyes becomes dry. So become dry. So and many students have no parents to support their learning at home. You know what happened here? We forced all the parents to adopt what we call homeschooling. But only very few parents in the world are capable of being a teacher of their homeschooling kids, okay? The skill of homeschooling. Most of us prefer schools to do the job for us. No, kids at home, no, thank you very much, go to school, okay? So this is different. And teachers are not skilled in online teaching. They are not. The fact that somebody told them use the Zoom doesn't mean they are skilled in using the Zoom. They can learn the technical, very simple. We all know it's very simple, the technical, but it's much beyond the technical issues of the Zoom. So I have 2 slides, that's all. First, initial conclusion, when they maybe also in the future, Tara, I don't know, because this is part of the human nature. Okay, you know how many people in 12,000 years ago have been eaten by a lion because the human body saw a lion and was shocked. Okay, has been shocked. So this is something of us. Okay, policymaker responds to public pressures and systematically, because in times of crisis we all face uncertainty, and the response of politicians is save my soul. Take what you want. Take what you want. We don't want to be against you. A lack of information all the time. We all know from basic books about organization, we all know the theory of uncertainty, on environmental uncertainty. Yes, that's what happened. I don't know who is contagious, who is not contagious, what will happen with the pandemic, what won't happen. And fears about emotional development of young people. And this is my conclusion. If I had to suggest some conclusion, this is a paper I wrote yesterday or a day before to one of our journals like economics. And I said, they asked me to write some recommendations for the next Minister of Education, because we are going to have a new government here. And I said, first, pay less attention to exams and achievement gaps. I'm not afraid of achievement gaps, yeah, English sometimes, you know. So I'm not afraid of that, because as long as children knows math, basic math and reading in the 1st and 2nd graders, all the other curriculum, okay, or kind of curriculum, they are subjectively determined. They are not what we call the Bible. They are subjectively determined. So I'm not afraid of that. But I am afraid that if we stick to the Ofsted in England, okay, I don't know in Canada the name, but Ofsted in England, okay? So if we stick to it, we will lose what the kids really need after a year of trauma. They need more attention to emotions. They need the teachers to support their fears of the next pandemic. And many of them probably have experienced a death in their family. So the teachers should be there for them. Readaptation to school is critical. And after a year, as you said, Tara, since the World War II, we had never had such a break in our schools, a long break. So they need that time. Teachers should be trained to adapt with their kids again, okay, to help their children to adapt the school again, and emphasize social values and group cohesion as a way to face the traumatic events. In times of trauma, we are a herd. We stick to each other in order to feel safe, and that's what they need. Thank you very much for listening to what I had to say. I will.
Thank you so much, Professor Plataga, for that extremely interesting and exciting presentation. But having spoken of being policy unstable, to quote your words, and to have all those types of uncertainties, yet Israel is now having a situation where more than 70% of its population is vaccinated, and you have less than 20 cases per day, and your schools are now functional. So that's a huge hurrah, but I really took some important points from your presentation, which we will talk about during the discussion. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
With that, I'm going to invite, is Baila? Yes, she's there. So Baila Raza Jamil, she's from Pakistan. She actually represents South Asia today, apart from Sujata and myself and the Education Forum Sri Lanka. So Baila is the CEO of Idara Talimo Gahani. I don't know whether I pronounced it correctly. It's a Center for Education and Consciousness, and she's also a public policy specialist, an innovator, and an activist. Baila is engaged with COVID-19 responses at the local, provincial, national, and global levels with close collaboration with the government on teleschool, which deals with digital learning initiatives. She also deals with social protection and health services in schools. She is spearheading safe school reopening multi-sectoral initiatives at federal level. Over to you, Baila. We are really honored to have you with us today.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you for the framing of this conversation and the two previous presentations that we just saw. The two speakers spoke very eloquently, about the COVID experience and the responses at the country levels. And I think that really gives us a tremendous spectrum to which we can relate to, and it resonates very well. And I think I would like to preface by saying right at the outset that all the deficits or the challenges that Tara had highlighted, I would also like for us to think about the notion of the COVID dividends as we move on, especially Tara's urging us to think about system level changes. Can we go to the next slide, please? And I'll just keep saying next. So I think just to remind ourselves that Pakistan had repeated emergencies really on a spectrum from 2005 to till now, from natural disasters to militancy, displacements, and health pandemics. So it's been quite a mixed experience of emergencies, and quite frequently. And no matter how we look at it, education remains a frontline sector where learning gets suspended often, and schools are used as shelters and even health spots. But we've seen very little policy in place backed by codes of conduct or resources or safe facilities or even preparedness. Nobody talks about schools going through preparedness routines or parents. And there's very rare that we see an emergency response or code of conduct, and capacity building happens just in fits and starts. But of course, this pandemic is very unique, just at scale. The fact that there has been no discrimination between poor and rich, and definitely requires resetting of systems. We've seen that in emergency funding, only 3% really goes to education. However, we've seen in this pandemic, the government has really at the federal level upgraded its coordination mechanisms, but also down to the provincial levels. But we've seen also industry and civil society activism, a lot of donor coordination and better data management and analysis. Next, please. So the challenge of the pandemic, is there, but we've had a massive challenge prior to the pandemic. This is just putting the frame, kind of a context out. Pakistan had already almost 23 million children out of school. We've had low learning levels that, my organization, a citizen-led organization, does every year, and it's benchmarked by the government and every other agency. We have a Right to Education Act and entitlement in the Constitution. But of course, the COVID led to school closures of more than 40 million school-going learners. And they're bound to be learning and enrollment losses, which they are. And the World Bank had already put our learning poverty level at 75% compared to 58% in the rest of South Asia. So the learning emergency was already there. And the question is, we are not talking just about 1 million kids more added to the 23 million, perhaps much more than that. So the challenges of out-of-school children, quality, lack of uniformity, etc., were there. Next, please. And girls' education, of course, gets most impacted. If we looked at the coordination, and I love really that comment on the unstable policies, I think it's just a fabulous way to put it. We've seen that all along. But we had the National Command and Operations Center, NCOC, established in April 2020. That really was the nerve center to bring every ministry together. I don't think Pakistan has ever had it, with the Prime Minister in charge, as well as all provincial heads and relevant ministries working together. That one window operation has helped Pakistan tremendously. And I wonder if this kind of a deliverology, if I can call it, will persist, because that's needed, because it brought everyone together. And that meant not only policies on education, health, social protection, economy, etc., but there were daily updates that anyone can get to, including access to the vaccine that is out there. And oh my goodness, Izhar, I'm so jealous, of the 70% coverage. We are nowhere near that. But it's happening, and there are many challenges because teachers, students, parents are still concerned, is it safe? So the myths of the vaccine still continue, and that is also not letting people push forward. We also had, together with that, the Interprovincial Education Ministerial Conference. That's a regular quarterly coordinated body, which was upgraded for this facility, which the federal government used with the provincial departments for vigorous responses. And I tell you, throughout this period, what has been school opening and closing, we've had 3 major school opening and closings, more schools, more time spent closed than open, but at least it helped for transparent updates on COVID-19 on the ministry's website, with a very vibrant social media in Urdu and English, giving messages all the time. But, unlike, all of us feel that, but such pressure on assessments, examination, students coming out on strike, not wanting to sit for face-to-face examinations because it's not safe, online, and the government going back and forth on this whole business of assessment, abridged curriculum, again, big problems on that, what is being shortened for accelerated learning, etc. But at the same time, on a positive note, working on an EdTech response for digital learning or distance learning on a spectrum, again, from those who had nothing in terms of technology or just a simple phone, to those who had televisions and computers and laptops and really online stuff. But an interesting also response on inclusive learning for children with disabilities. Meanwhile, national curriculum and education policy initiatives have been ongoing, and a lot of debate on that, but a lot of effort on resource mobilization from development partners for the COVID responses. So that's there, and it's been quite of a buzzing environment on seeing really what will fit well and align with the challenges of the COVID. Next, please. This is just giving you a sense of our net enrollment rates at primary at 66%, middle at 38%, secondary at 27%. So Pakistan has a huge crisis of primary, but more in middle or post-primary, and more effect. The girls remain the most affected over there. Is there a possibility to bridge this gap is another question. Will COVID dividend help us with accelerating this now that we may not need all the brick and mortar solutions? Maybe we can come up with other second chance options for girls and boys both. Next, please. I think I do want to bring in the fact that the social protection program across the country called ESAS has come up with a very at scale response. And sometimes we're looking only at the education responses. I really wanted to bring the social protection response because it is at scale. It's reaching like about 18 million households, wanting to reach about 9, 10 or 11 million students, where you're looking at, again, the early childhood, the first 1,000 days, called the National Nama Program for Mothers and Children, going off to primary, and this is all conditional cash transfers at primary, at post-primary, even undergrad scholarships and digital learning and employment initiatives. And I do want us to think, especially in countries like Pakistan, and how these kind of social protection programs can facilitate and accelerate at-scale solutions for so many out-of-school children. I think just that is so important to think about if you're talking about, again, about 25 million out-of-school children. Next, please. So, of course, let's not forget the education sector working group. You know, the UNICEF is in the lead, and it brings together government, CSOs, and industry. Next, please, very fast. Just to share that, you know, the education emergencies group set up, you know, emergency scenarios, whether it is on the humanitarian response plan or also the humanitarian needs overview plan, because we've got the monsoon season setting in as well as the COVID, with their own targets. But the idea is to look at aspects of DRR, disaster response, trainings, capacity building, warehouse storage, those, but the soft areas still remain the same. As I'd shared before, looking at teleschool, which is TV right round from 8 in the morning till 5 and 6 in the evening. And that will continue, but the non-formal and catch-up programs, digital learning and E9 initiatives, and of course, the mental health and psychosocial support program, which is a big issue. We've seen in adolescents at least 30% being affected by some kind of trauma and mental health issues. And of course, mobilization of resources. Next, please, and we'll move fast. Just next, sorry, next, please. Maybe this was just, next, please. Next, please. But of course, civil society, the one before. Civil society has been, and industry has been very active. We've had an amazing coming together of a technology through a consortium. We've had an online resource repository, learning materials on tech, even through WhatsApp, SMSs are there for everyone to take. And the governments at provincial level and federal level are doing a lot in collaborations through public-private partnerships with industry on tech. And there's a lot there, and I could share that later also. But this is a buzzing space, but it is not a complete solution, as we know, because not more than 30% have some access to some kind of EdTech facility. We've got a whole lot of, I mean, when we talk about 30%, we're talking about almost 14 million children, but there's a whole lot out there who do not have it. So we need to think about that as well. Next, please. I just wanted to say we've been involved in the Safe School Reopening Pilot, and if you can just move fast, this is a non-pharmaceutical intervention, and it's looking at ways to do a pilot. If it works well, it can be scaled up pretty fast. Next, please. So the idea is that it has 3 types of interventions. One is getting community involved, but doing everything through an evidence-based baseline, midline, and endline to see the impact of the 3 interventions of community mobilization and having community voice, including students and teachers, agency on what should be done. Type 2 is looking at infrastructure and maintenance and repair equipment for safe schools. And type 3 is looking at wash and health services, including social emotional learning, innovations such as telehealth, and IC materials for behavior change. Next, please. So it's a very fast moving program. These are just images to share with you how in some schools we have tested this out. Next, please. And next, this is the infrastructure. This is the facilities coming for masks and safe schools and safe behavior. Next, please. And how to make their own disinfectants to promote hygiene culture and to have different kinds of IC materials, booklets for the members. Next, please. Nudges. Next, please. Next, please. More communities. And also the Malala Education Network and getting lots of people on board and youth on board to do things where those who are really at the bottom of the pyramid, those who you call almost the third bucket, can be given agency to do many exciting things at their own level. And these networks are connecting very fast through the Malala education network and the fund set up for the COVID initiative, where the push is towards girls in STEM, girls in school, a case for making more investment in this. And the multipliers are amazing as we go along. Next, please. And this is again the Second Chance program that I'd shared earlier, where whilst we are implementing during this period, we're also looking at evaluations which can give us proof of concept to do things at scale. And next, please, I'll just go on the recommendations. So my recommendations really is that how can we ensure that emergencies not remain in silos? Because you've seen it in the past, at least we have, that these are emergency and education work, mainstream work remains almost in parallel silos. They come together and then they disappear again, but the entire budgets and the way you do liquidation is so separate that the administrative aspects of it just insist that emergency responses must be separated from the mainstream. And the question is, how can these be mainstreamed in the mindset, policies, plannings, and budget and implementation so that its emergencies on the spectrum can be part of the education system? How do you embed that in the sector policies and plans at federal and provincial levels, including district action plans? We have the right to education laws as a fundamental right. Will the rules have sufficient space to cover emergency and preparedness? We do need the scaled up technology support. And that technology support is not just for education and learning, but for preparedness, health, social protection, because everything now is going on the cell phones or your numbers, where to get and have access to your cash transfers. And of course, bridging the digital divide overall is so important. The non-pharmaceutical initiatives have been tested and they really need to be mainstreamed with data that is present. But one thing that has come out in a big way, the Ministry of Health was giving out all the standards for what basic facilities in school should look like. But when went and measured those, they were woefully short. Of course, there was no way to see safe distance. The facilities, as they meant on the ratio of per student, per teacher, etc., was just not there. And of course, the budgets for innovative initiatives that need to be there, irrespective of the pandemic. These are all system level recommendations. We are so shy in our governments on innovations and initiatives, which are left often to the development partners. Why not leave it in the mainstream when our industry and young people, startups are doing brilliant work? And whether it is on edtech, telehealth, psychosocial health, yoga online, we've just tested. We've done the Sehat Kahani, which is again online, and health services in school, which remain again absent. They're conspicuous by their absence. And giving agencies to students so they're self-directed and not so depressed because somebody has to tell them what to do. Generally, a better communication strategy with all stakeholders, but especially parents, even those who may be unlettered or those who may be educated. Certainly, we've seen the schools, the homes becoming a buzz, almost like mini schools, even where the parents really did not know, and where we put community activists near the homes where the parents really were unlettered and had a big challenge. How do you make your budgets for emergency into recurrent mainstream budget so that there are always resources for preparedness and school drills and emergency responses? I mean, it shouldn't take people by shock, as Tara said and others have said, that there will be more emergencies like this at scale, which you've never seen in our lifetime. And of course, budgets for content development, training of the workforce, whether teachers or non-teaching staff, on emergency preparedness in both pre-service and in-service program. This is just a beginning, but I think I would urge us to begin to look at the COVID dividends, particularly for systems upgradation. I'll stop there. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Baila, for that extremely informative and interesting presentation. I particularly liked how you reiterated over and over again the necessity for resetting funding locally and globally, and the importance of integrating this type of funding for preparedness, emergency preparedness, into the recurrent as well as the capital budgets annually. And that's essentially a policy level decision, as all of us would know. So I'm now going over to our next speaker, Dr. Katja Saville. She's a lecturer and a researcher at the University College London Institute of Education. Previously, she taught in state primary schools in England, USA, Germany, and Eritrea for 17 years. Her research expertise is in bilingual education and language learning, particularly in state primary school systems. She's currently moving on the Moving Up research project, investigating the impact of the pandemic on students who are transitioning from primary to secondary schools. It's very pleasing and exciting to have you on our panel, Katja, particularly in regards to the work you're doing in relation to the impact assessments that we mentioned earlier. Over to you.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me to talk about some of the impacts of the pandemic. And like you said, my research is looking particularly at transitioning year 6 to year 7 pupils, but I'll be talking more generally to begin with, but then also specifically about the research that I'm involved in, because that's what I can speak on well. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you. And thank you so much as well to the other presenters. It's really interesting seeing the overlaps, and hopefully I remember to kind of relate my points, but I was definitely nodding away listening to many of these aspects. So if I can just present that whole screen, that's probably best. So I've put here English schools' response to COVID-19, but really a proviso to say about that is, which I think is true of all the systems we've been talking about, that much is centralized, and it's been a massive discussion point in England how much of the response has been centralized, and it arguably needs to be, but what that has left schools being able to do and unable to do to respond in their individual context. So a proviso that it really is I'm trying to talk more generally about the system rather than individual schools. But just to kind of give you an overline of the events as they happen in England, like I think other presenters have said, it was really March 2020 when everything kicked in with the first lockdown, the kind of real crisis that none of us had ever seen before. And at that point, automatically overnight, all schools and nurseries were closed, and exams were cancelled, I think a day or two later, which has been a really big point all the way up to university level now. And certainly working in a university, we've got bulges of students because it suddenly meant that teacher assessment grades were not accepted at first. They were downgraded for very many vulnerable children as well in disadvantaged areas, and then they removed that blanket, which meant suddenly there were a load of students able to attend university, but then many deferred, and that's had knock-on effects for students this year getting in. But that's a little sideline, but it does come through as a thread that this lack of kind of exams is going to have an impact on those cohorts of students in particular, for already questioning the validity of their grades and their achievements. And at that point in the first lockdown, most schools and nurseries did allow key workers and vulnerable students assessed by eligibility for free school meals and deprivation in, but that was very little uptake because most schools interpreted that as being you need to have both parents who are eligible and will not be at home. And I know a lot of nurseries, even though they had some key worker children, shut at that point because they just didn't have enough demand. But June 2020, the schools were allowed to reopen, but because it was so near the end of the school year, that's typically the third week in July, many of them, it was a half-hearted thing, a very gentle thing focused on well-being. And I looked at the notes from your last education forum, and you talked about the need for schools to consider the academic, but also the well-being and the health measures. And I really think at that point, the return to school was about prioritizing children's mental health and well-being through this trauma and allowing them to readjust to being in school. And certainly at primary, but also some cases secondary, that was very limited. And we had some contestation by some schools in areas where rates were relatively high still, or just a lot of fear from the parents. So only partially schools went back. Some only went back 2 days a week. They had half the year group and the other half. And it started a few weeks earlier with the very youngest before opening up to the oldest as well. It meant though that the assumption was in September, everybody would be back to normal. And that is kind of how it worked out then in September for the new school year. However, by that point, rates were starting to rise, first of all, in pockets of the north of England. And we did have local lockdowns which tested the system. And by that point, my research was looking at secondary schools. And certainly there, what we found is that quite a percentage of our teachers and students had experienced their bubbles bursting. So often they'd be kept in bubbles of 30 to 100 and something students to limit the spread of COVID. And once there was a case, then all of them had to stay at home for 10 days. And so schools were actually going into the September time, preparing curricula to go online, and had a chance over the summer to do so. And government funding at some point then was released to allow secondary schools to provide laptops for all, but actually not primaries. So that will come up again as something that helps schools to prepare for then what happened with a national lockdown. There was a second lockdown, but schools were named as a priority to remain open. And in fact, there was a little bit of which I think one of the other speakers referred to, a little bit of a question mark about whether schools were the cause of this rise again of a second wave at that point. So it really was only lockdown 3 in January, and Boris Johnson and the other leaders were insistent schools would remain open, to the point that parents put their children to bed saying, okay, school tomorrow, and then had to wake them up the next morning and say, nope, you're back at home for now. And the first day back at school in January, of some students who really hadn't been much at all, like 4- and 5-year-old children, it was awful. But at that point, nurseries were allowed to stay open. Exams then pretty quickly were cancelled then once it was clear that it was going to be 6 weeks or more that schools would be shut. It wouldn't be fair on those students again. And this time though, especially because the government had been insisting schools wouldn't close, many more key workers, people were scrambling for key worker places. They'd seen how parents, like I think Professor Aplaka had said, they're not prepared to be homeschoolers, and some of them had faced disastrous situations. So, you know, they were desperate to get one or all of their children back into school. And then some schools were reporting up to 50%, 60% of their students were asking to come in. And they were eligible according to the much broader guidelines, and schools were panicking. But so that was also a management issue, but also a reality that you know, 25% roughly of students were actually in school during that second lockdown, and they had a very different experience, which I'll come back to. Then around February, a very eminent educator, Kevin Collins, was appointed to head the Recovery Commission. That made the government look like they were taking things really seriously, and he was talking about a £15 billion recovery programme. Basically, a few days ago, he resigned when the government said it would be £1.4 billion instead. It basically works out as £22, which is, I think, about $40 or less per pupil, when apparently the US is over 1,000. And so he's resigned in disgust and said, no, that is not a kind of budget that is going to make any difference. And none of the plans that he was prioritizing, you know, 3 prongs, 3 T's: teaching, you know, investing in helping teachers, but tutoring for catch up, but also just time in subjects that have been missed during the pandemic. And then basically shortly after mid-March onwards, schools pretty quickly reopened with a slightly different focus this time, actually, although there was some element of the need to process trauma. That was far less because, you know, we've had vaccinations rise, so cases have definitely fallen. And I think this was about, right, let's get back to learning business a bit more this time. So I'm going to be talking about comparing lockdown learning at home and at school, and some of the things that came up during those. In lockdown one, the real issue, and I think this is probably for every system in this, was about moving online. And although a few children, certainly from my interviews with children, definitely thrived from being more independent, they could pursue their own learning, particularly at primary level. 11-year-olds, you know, they actually love not having that structure. Actually, there was a whole fragmentation of learning, and so cohorts of children, you know, some learned well online or were given resources, and in other schools they weren't really given very much, and it was a bit of a disaster. So kind of there was a focus on well-being from schools who were left in this panicky situation, particularly primary schools in more vulnerable areas, disadvantaged areas. The focus was really like, how are our kids going to, you know, manage lockdown in homes where things are a little bit chaotic. So it was literally teachers providing lunches by walking to all the different homes of children in the area sometimes. And there were a lot of more welfare referrals as well. But comparing that situation and then with lockdown 2 in November, schools were way more prepared. So there were still some digital issues, particularly around this laptop scheme and primaries, again, not being able to access that. But schools had been able to plan, and through these little local lockdowns or burst bubbles, it prepared them for that second lockdown. And actually, from talking to students and teachers in our recent research, their experience of that is far smoother. You know, no, I mean, they didn't always like it, you know, and there were issues that other people have talked about with the quality of Zoom learning, but they knew what they were doing. They felt that they were part of a school community and they knew what was happening and and a lot of the students talked about making progress in that time. Obviously, there's an equity concern about this lockdown learning at home, which I think is probably true everywhere. I've talked about the laptop scheme, but during the second lockdown as well, the mobile phone companies started to talk about using, because some schools and children would be dependent on using phones and uploading pictures of work on their phones, talking about free phone broadband for vulnerable children. I'm not sure how successful that was, but it's certainly one of our things that we're trying to push for, that should maybe be a broadband kind of scholar scheme that would provide all families with some kind of token or incentive to be able to get free broadband ongoing to support home learning. And obviously then when we talk about lockdown learning at home, we're talking in the most recent lockdown, in some cases 25% of students still being in school. And some of those students, particularly the most vulnerable, thrived because they had far more small group attention during that time. However, teachers were massively overloaded, particularly in the second lockdown, because it was almost double work. Sometimes they were having to teach in class but have, you know, the video on and parents and students watching at home. And I had that at university as well, and it's very stressful. And then having to mark and set things online. And it also meant that actually the quality for some children who were in school wasn't as good, because they were basically their teacher was at home maybe, and they were sat in school on a laptop. So it was very different again. Learning once back at school, the question was about this in the first lockdown, a more well-being focus, in the second lockdown, maybe a more learning focus on return to school. But obviously, once children did return to school, well, what did that look like? And certainly for the students I was looking at, it was, you know, massive restrictions on them, and the impact on schools and particularly children of masks, needing to wear them, not particularly getting on with those, but also feeling in new schools for transitioning pupils that it created a barrier in terms of relationships. But bubbles as well, you know, the restricted numbers, which in primary school, maybe students are very used to being in smaller groups, but in secondary school, you know, they're used to more freedom. Play equipment and space, a lot of the students we've spoken to talked of just being 100 students in a football pitch, you know, that was where they're allowed to go at lunchtime, and they're not allowed to interact with others. And then a particularly restricted curriculum, and I'd be interested to hear how much that is the case in other countries and other contexts. But you know, certainly at primary, a focus on English and maths, and in the first lockdown, and you know, more kind of open-ended project. Okay, well, let's do this. My interest in languages, a lot of languages learning, primary and secondary, was just axed. I believe in the second lockdown that wasn't quite the same, but certainly a lot of practical activities back at school haven't been taking place for all of year 7. So they haven't been able to go, in many cases, to science blocks or art studios. So they haven't been doing science experiments, a lot of the children are telling me. But in the last few weeks, that's starting to change now that our rates have come down, although they might be rising up again here. And yeah, I've talked about local outbreaks, and you know, possibly there'll be more of those. Lateral flow testing at secondary. So to allow secondaries to open, the government, you know, introduced routine testing to allow students to come back to school, and then ongoing. And actually schools have worked really hard. They've actually taken over the government's job in a lot of these cases in organising this. There hasn't been the provision. You know, when there's been an outbreak, it's the head teacher during their school holidays spending 6 hours on the phone ringing every parent to tell them, you know. But the lateral flow testing has been useful in kind of tracking things, and there have been false positives, but it is kind of well managed now at this point. And catch-up tutoring has been a big thing, a part of this recovery commission. It's all been talked about, and you know, these huge budgets that have just now shrunk, and it still hasn't been distributed. And there's been some question about, you know, well, where are these tutors going to come from, and how is that going to be managed? And it looks now, with that Kevin Collins resigning, we're back a bit to square one on everything. And I've talked about the uncertainty for exam year groups and the knock-on problems for admissions and transitions in general. Specific issues for the students that I've been talking to, the year 6 to 7 transition, and that they've obviously lost out on a lot of their leaving of primary school. Some of them didn't even go back to primary school after lockdown lifted, and they had no opportunities to visit their secondary school, but they have adapted so well. And secondary schools tried and moved a lot of the stuff online, but that created equity issues for those who didn't have that digital access, which primary schools then tried to provide in that little window before starting, but some children were missed. And particularly in the research that we did, the children we're concerned about is those who get normally extra support, like those with special needs or from vulnerable backgrounds, would normally get extra days at their secondary school, and they just didn't get anything extra. However, you know, secondary schools, once children started, often gave one extra day or a few days where it's just year 7. And one of the things that we've seen is this idea that bubbles have actually acted in a way as an extended transition. And when you look at the transition specific literature, that is something to be welcomed, that transition isn't seen as just one event, but an ongoing thing. And I'm just trying to think, I'm aware of time. Yeah, I think I've talked about the restricted curriculum and other things that are on there. Yeah, and no and little extracurricular trips or clubs. That has made a kind of difference to students, but they understand why. But in a way, their friendships have been a little limited. But year 7 is kind of seen, perhaps wrongly, as a bit of a remedial year. Secondary schools assume that students aren't really at the levels that their primary schools say they're at, and they kind of take a backward step anyway. So for a lot of the students, they feel that actually year 7 has been quite gentle, and they feel that it's maybe because teachers have been a bit gentle on them coming back. But so maybe the specific issues for transitioning pupils haven't been as bad as we wanted. And this is kind of talking about the COVID dividend that I think the previous speaker talked about. What is that in terms of I can only really talk necessarily about the research that I'm doing, but certainly this online learning leap, you know, this our data, our survey data shows that teachers' confidence when they rated themselves on online learning before the pandemic and after the first lockdown, after the second lockdown, you know, it's just leaped. Schools and students are also saying that now more routinely homework is provided online, that it's much smoother to manage, also schools are ready now for other emergencies. We don't have monsoons, we don't have earthquakes in England, but my local school was burnt down in October. So the kids had been back 6 weeks and it was burnt down, and it took them 6 months to get back, you know, to schools, but schools were ready now to do that. To provide other types of learning, but the digital divide is still massively there, and I think we've all spoken about that. Bubbles, we've talked about, I mentioned that kind of have they been actually protecting transitioning students? So those students going in have been kept with their class or maybe their year group, often in one building. It means they've had less interaction with older pupils. They haven't got lost in these big campuses. And many of them have talked about those kind of close relationships with their class, because they would usually have different teachers and we go into different rooms, but they've become much closer. But they also have mixed views, and they do want to meet other students. And then finally, is this an opportunity, certainly in England, for an exam system overhaul? So going back to trusting teachers, you know, there was this revolt when teacher grades were taken in, teacher assessments, and then graded by a central government algorithm, like, oh, well, you said this in this area of London, but typically your students in this area of London don't achieve as well as that. So we're going to downgrade all your students' grades by a mark. So there were students, some schools where no students were coming out with A's, but they did, you know, usually have some, and they were losing their university. And then there was just such a public revolt, as Professor Ablaka talked about, you know, no, actually, we need to trust the teachers, and actually maybe more rigor can be put around in this year, that teacher assessment system. It's creating a massive workload for teachers, but actually, if that exam system can be overhauled to look much more rigorously at teacher assessment, again, that might provide an opportunity to move away from this assumption that the written exam is everything. It isn't in the English context, but it's still a huge thing. So that's just some of my thoughts there, and some of my experiences. And I look forward to the panel discussion in a little bit, where maybe we can talk about some of the issues that come across all of us. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Katja, for that extremely interesting presentation. I'm moving straight away on to our final speaker, Mr. Gareth Manning. He's a global educator focused on evolving education into effect transformative social change. He has worked in a wide range of cultural and institutional contexts on 5 continents, specializing in social sciences, digital pedagogies, and personalized project-based learning. He holds a master's degree in comparative, international, and development education, and is host of the World Teacher podcast. Over to you, Gareth.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Let me just get this sorted out. Okay, so thank you very much. Thanks so much for inviting me to this. I'm not sure I fit in well with this panel of like very eminent people with all sorts of research-based arguments about what's going on and what should happen, but I come with, I think, perhaps a bit of a different perspective. Who am I? How do I make this go? Well, I'm a global educator. I've taught in, I think, 11 different countries on 5 continents. I've taught in all sorts of different places. I've taught in Japanese junior high schools, Jamaican slums, elite American schools, schools that travel all over the world. I've taught in some of the most privileged and some of the most underprivileged contexts. And that gives me a particular lens, I think. And I also look at the problem from a very pragmatic standpoint as a teacher having to actually deal with this. I call myself an evolutionary. I think we need to very significantly rethink how we approach systems in the world, in life, in education, and globally. I think it's really important that we take seriously the problems that we face on Earth and that we work intentionally and with love to try to improve the world, but we do so in a way with care. Revolutions hurt people, but we need that level of change with respect to scale. Some context for this problem. I think it's important to recognize that kids not being in school in COVID has a backdrop of kids not being in school in general. So there's a global lack of universal schooling across the world. Countries vary in terms of years of schooling. We all know this. 258 million kids were out of school in 2018, prior to the pandemic. Huge numbers. According to UNESCO, about 20% of primary age out of school kids will never attend schools. Now, we've seen improvement over time. This graph shows that there has been a significant improvement in terms of being able to attain school. There's been increases in gender parity in particular, but we still see massive differences in terms of school completion. That matters. Why? Well, because kids work. It's just the nature of the world. Most kids who are out of school because they need to be, working for their families, given situational contexts. If you need to fetch water and you need to wash clothes, it might not be that important to study, I don't know, say algebra, because it might not be very relevant to your life situation. Another part of the backdrop to this is that there's been a growing youth mental health crisis in the world. These data come from the United States. The US is relatively generalizable, at least to the Anglosphere, with respect to really negative mental health outcomes for kids. Kids have been increasing with respect to feelings of hopelessness and sadness, increased depression, anxiety, increased suicidality, increased non-suicidal self-injury. And these are really significant increases over the last decade of roughly about 40%. And that really matters. I don't know how generalizable these findings are to developing country contexts. I'm very curious to know that, but I think that that is a phenomenon that's really important to bear in mind. The mental health crisis that we're experiencing now predated COVID and was exacerbated by COVID. The current crisis. So this is a really cool map that the World Bank education people created of countries with fully closed schools. Number of students, 681 million as of yesterday. Number of students in countries with partially closed schools, 92 million. And then add that on top of the kids who were never in school in the first place. And we've got a lot of kids who are in a very difficult situation right now. This map shows length of time by number of weeks that kids have been out of school. In Sri Lanka, it's 50 weeks so far. But to what extent is missing school really a problem? I think it's an important question. I think we all come with the assumption that school is important. But if we, I think the fact that so many kids are working and are out of school, out of necessity, raises a question as to whether school in those contexts are necessary in the first place. What's the point of school? Is the point of school to help kids prepare for market economies? Is it to help kids develop as whole humans? I think realistically, it's probably both. At the very least, the reality is that school really makes a difference. There's a huge relationship between education, credentials, and income, as we all know. And for most people, unless you get an education, you don't really have much of a route to upward mobility with respect to employment, and therefore to financial freedom, and therefore to self-determination. There are exceptions. I mean, in Toronto, for instance, there was one group of people, Portuguese people in particular, who did less well in schools on average, but they did less well in schools on average because parents took them out of schools to put them into construction work to make a ton more money than I make. So it's not always bad that people are out of school. And moreover, not all cultures equally value master's degrees and working 70-hour weeks. And maybe it would be better if we were able to learn from cultures that value those kind of ways of being a little bit less, especially given the pressures that we're putting on our climate. I think school matters because it's a basic human right. It's a right of the child. It's Article 28 of the UN Convention on the Right of the Child. It's SDG number 4. I think school really matters. I think we probably all agree, but not all school systems are created equally. As we know, these are data from PISA. Just that kids go to school at all doesn't tell us much about the quality of education that occurs within that building. So you can go to school for 7 years, but have 7 years of terrible education. Or you can go to schools in a place like Singapore, where if you go to school, you're probably going to come out a very, very good reader. You might not come out with as advanced, maybe, creative abilities or entrepreneurial mindsets. That's debatable. Trade-offs are made. But this matters because when we come to learning loss, if it happens at all, it's going to happen in very different ways in different places. And that's important to recognize. It doesn't happen equally. This is a really interesting study that I encountered yesterday. It's looking at one of the best case scenarios for the pandemic. It was a natural experiment that occurred in the Netherlands. You had kids who were out of school right before and after a national exam. And so they were able to actually test out the impact of Zoom school, of being at home. And this is a great situation because it was a short lockdown, only 8 weeks. There's relatively equitable school funding in this scenario, and they all had amazing internet access. So this is kind of the best situation, right? How well can they handle this? They studied 350,000 kids and they found that learning loss occurred nonetheless. So even if you have a really, really ideal resources at hand, it's not automatically going to be the case that teachers are going to be able to transition to teaching online in ways that are going to produce the same levels of measurable achievement. I think that kind of matters. Is substantial learning loss online inevitable? That's a question. And why does learning loss really matter anyway? Well, I think learning loss is inevitable within the system. Learning loss occurs and has been occurring since the system was created with summer breaks. Summer learning loss is a normal school system attribute. About 25 to 30% of what's learned in a school year is lost over that break because of the nature of human memory. We are forgetting animals. We forget far more than we remember, and we only remember well with significant repetition spaced over time. Moreover, the shift to online learning was totally unplanned. Nobody was ready for this. There were very few places in the world were able to handle this. And the truth is, as our last speaker pointed out, teachers have been learning. They will improve their practices. They will get better and better at this. That said, though, I do think digital learning will nonetheless remain inferior as a teacher. Having dealt with this for the last year, I think that there's for a lot of reasons it's inferior. It's slower. It takes a lot more time to plan. I'm less able to adapt like instantaneously to student needs. There's a lot of technological kerfufflery and problems that happen. And I think it will remain inferior, at least until AI improves very, very significantly. And I think that'll be at least 10 or 15 years. That's just a guess though. Does it matter? Well, I think learning loss actually wouldn't matter if we didn't care about the system so much. Learning loss is a product of this educational system. The fact is, kids are learning all the time. Kids are natural learners. The question is, what are they learning and to what extent? And do we care about those things that they're learning? School systems were designed by Prussians to, in militarized, industrialized contexts, to educate masses of people from very low levels of education to high levels of education in unfair ways. They were designed intentionally to sort people out, to select the so-called like better people for more privileged managerial roles in society. And this was done on the basis of class, race, gender, and ability on purpose. The systems that we have now work the way they were designed to. The problem is that the system was designed for students to adapt to this system in a competitive way and to be excluded from the system. It was designed to create losers. But we have evolved culturally in terms of our expectations. We've become more caring people. The circle of compassion, as Gandhi put it, has expanded. We now care about equity, inclusion, equal opportunities, and outcomes for kids all over the world. That's awesome. But to get there, we need to rethink this system. I just do not believe that we're going to be able to jig with it forever to eventually get to a point of equity, because the fundamental design is hegemonic and designed for the opposite. I think learning loss matters because we've made it matter. Kids are going to be forced to adapt. They're not going to get the support they need, and they will and are suffering the consequences. Mental health. So we have a learning loss problem, we have a mental health problem. This is US data on mental health outcomes with respect to anxiety and depressive disorders over the last year. Very, very significant increase for adults. According to the OECD, COVID-19 has turned into a mental health crisis for young people. Again, there was already a mental health crisis. This is exacerbating the mental health crisis, and we don't truly know the extent of it. We just don't have the data yet. Some data indicate that mental health disorders have more than doubled for young people. And it is the case that young people are more likely to report, not necessarily experience, but at least report anxiety and depression far more than older people. So it could be the case that the rates for young people are even greater than that graph that I just showed you. I think this is really, really, really important. For me, the mental health crisis vastly outweighs the learning loss crisis. And I think that's what we need to put attention on most. I work at a very, it's actually my last day of work. I've got a few more official days, but basically I'm done at Think Global School. It's been an amazing experience. Think Global School is a school that travels to, or used to pre-COVID, 4 countries a year on 6 continents over a 3-year cycle. We specialize in experiential place-based learning from the locals in country contexts about things that matter, and helping students design project-based learning, helping them figure out who they are, what it is that they care about, what they're passionate about, and then designing their own learning projects around that to really deliver the kind of results that you get when you really bolster human motivation, intrinsic motivation in particular. It's an amazing school. It's very cool. And at TGS, we have no learning loss. It doesn't exist because we don't measure learning the way normal schools do. If you don't measure learning the way normal schools do, learning loss doesn't exist. It just doesn't. We have a flexible adaptive curriculum. Teachers design place-based experiential modules, and students design their own learning. And we put a tremendous amount of emphasis on advisory, like small group sessions to affect belonging, one-on-one sessions to support students, on personal project mentoring, and on counseling. Social emotional learning is embedded in everything that we do. How did we respond to this? Well, we were able to adapt to student needs, unlike the vast majority of teachers on the planet. So we designed modules on misinformation and critical media literacy because there was a lot of that going on. We saw that our students' mental health was really declining. And so we pushed for and were able to design modules solely focused on mental health for an entire term. And then kids could do their own thing at the same time. Did modules on design thinking, and we did a whole term that we just finished on service learning, kids doing active service learning projects in their own communities. It was great. Moreover, kids were doing their own thing already, and we just continued that. Very, very simple for us to adapt. I was probably in the luckiest situation on earth as a teacher during this. Is TGS replicable and scalable? The answer is no. You don't want to replicate a traveling high school. It's just not good for the world. And also, it's not really that necessary. There's a lot of other arguments against that. So let's just put that out. But I do think there are things to be learned that matter when we think about how to support kids in the short term. Getting back to normal. I think we need to really de-emphasize learning loss. We need to emphasize resilience, growth, and especially human connection, belonging. Get kids connected, let them be kids, and the resilience will happen naturally. It's easier for them. I would suggest, if I were a principal, I would be looking at the curriculum. I would be saying, okay, let's prioritize. Not all subjects are equal in terms of not just their importance, but also their nature in terms of how they must be taught and learned. So for instance, math is a cumulative subject. You miss 4 weeks of math and you go back to math class and you are behind and you're not going to get caught up unless you go back. So math has to have a mastery-based approach, which, by the way, is why Singapore is so amazing at math, because it makes sure every kid is constantly learning and not falling behind. So certain subjects like that really need to emphasize the mastery of lost concepts and skills. I think it's really important to emphasize individualized support, really getting kids to work with it effectively as givers and receivers of feedback. If you can really do that, then you can accelerate it really quickly. That's the key. For non-cumulative subjects, so I teach a lot of non-cumulative subjects, social science things, history, stuff like that. This is easy. The content is just arbitrary. The fact that like the history textbook has chosen these events is completely contestable. Indeed, it should be contested, and it's racist if you actually look at it in almost any country context. And because of that, I think it behooves us to make very serious choices. We should be choosing to focus on things that are relevant to kids, that are important, and then we can problematize curriculum in ways that are interesting to really engage students. It's actually not that hard if you have the power to do it. That said, I think this is the most important point I want to make. This is a great book. I strongly recommend every educator on earth read this book, The Self-Driven Child. I think the purpose of education is to help kids fundamentally determine their own lives, to be able to be self-directed in choosing what it is that they want to do with their lives. And how do you get people to do that? You have to help them learn how to learn. And you learn how to learn through the process of trial and error and making choices. In this context, kids have been massively deprived of choices. Go to school, don't go to school, learn online, learn in class with your teacher, with kids on the internet, just craziness. And they've constantly, throughout this, been deprived of choice at every single stage. When have the kids ever been asked, what should we do? A low sense of control may very well be the most stressful thing in the universe. It really does create chronic stress, which inhibits working memory, depletes the ability to learn, and has all sorts of negative behavioral consequences as well. It's really, really important that we give kids control. So I think the answer to both the school system collapse and the mental health fatigue problem is the same, which is to support kids to make meaningful choices about their own education, to enhance their agency. To the extent that they feel agentic, they will be able to get better at learning how to learn, and they'll be able to adapt in the future if situations like this happen, especially if we support it properly. If our kids knew how to autonomously learn, and they were given credit for it, this is crucial because schooling is largely about credentials and not learning, then much learning loss wouldn't have happened, more meaningful learning would have happened, and we would have had better mental health outcomes. That's what we have at TGS because of the nature of our design. The next crisis. Well, I think the hegemonic school system seriously needs to be replaced with alternative models. I don't really believe in this slow incremental reform of the system because fundamentally the incentives are misaligned to human needs. I think what we need is a proliferation of alternative models with experimentation and research all over the world. I think we really need to prioritize helping kids learn how to learn by designing and assessing their own projects for credit. And I really think we need to center social and emotional learning throughout everything that we do. With respect to policy, I think this means that we should reform curricula to prioritize student design project-based learning. This is possible. It's not easy, but it gets easy if you start early with kids when they're young and you have really good systems to be able to scaffold that throughout. I'm not saying only or shift systems entirely to project-based learning. In fact, I would say don't do that because you'll get worse outcomes with respect to knowledge development. I think it's important to have both. We want the accumulation of knowledge, but we also want to have kids build agency and self-direction. And we can do both, but only if we emphasize both. And currently we don't emphasize agency at all. I think we need to invest in teacher development. I think we need to decentralize school authority so that schools can make local decisions based on local needs, give teachers the power to be able to adapt to situations as best they can, make strong decisions in the interests of their students. We have to have internet access in the 2020s, 2030s, 2040s, 2050s. For the rest of this century, it's a basic human right. Kids do not have equal opportunity to learn unless and until every single kid on earth has excellent tech and excellent access to that tech. But access without support is not opportunity. And so we need a lot of emphasis on development. I think we need to invest seriously in research on educational technology. Not all apps are equal. Not all learning resources are equal. Just giving people access to the internet is insufficient. It's really matters what you do with it. And training is, to me, it's kind of everything. And the reason I come back to this is so we can make all these policy recommendations, you can pass all these policies, but it takes forever for that to actually trickle down to the classroom because teachers become a blocking point. If there's a dissonance between teacher understanding and what they're being asked to do, then what they're being asked to do doesn't happen. We see this around the world with respect to education reform. Formative assessment is a great example. Nobody in the world disagrees that formative assessment really matters. It's in every policy recommendation on earth. It's in Sri Lanka's policy documents. Yet you can find policy documents on you can find research on the internet from UNESCO, from the OECD, from all these different organizations that will show you again and again that the policies aren't implemented because teachers don't know how. We have to emphasize teacher development, and that takes a lot of investment. It's not easy. Future crises, I think this is important to recognize. We have 7.8 billion people as of this morning. We're going to add 3 billion in the next 80 years, 3 billion. That our planet can't really support this. So we need to really be very, very conscious of this as in thinking about future preparedness of schools. We have problems now with kids being out of school. Add 3 billion kids to the world. Most of the kids who are born are being born in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So that matters. And most of the places in the world that are highly vulnerable to climate change are also in the places with high fertility rates. According to the IPCC, they're expecting about 200 million climate migrants by 2050. Many of those will be children. I think we prepare for that by rethinking schools and prioritizing helping kids learn how to learn so that when the emergency hits, they'll have things to do. And if we can give kids credit for it, they'll have incentive. Those are my thoughts. I have a podcast, check it out, World Teacher Podcast, and you can reach me at those places. I'm very interested to have a conversation with you all. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Garrett, for that extremely provocative, interesting, and the controversial suggestions. I'm particularly thrilled how you mentioned that the mental health crisis far exceeds the learning losses. This is something that is getting neglected in all our countries, the understanding of the mental health crisis. And also how you insisted that the basic human right is actually access to EdTech, education technology. Right. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to move into the discussion. We have something like 45 minutes for the discussion, but there's nothing to stop us going an extra 5 to 10 minutes because we've had so much of interesting information coming out through the presentations. I didn't have the heart to warn our speakers that they were going above time. So with that, may I invite questions from the participants? Kindly press your raise hand button so that I know whom to invite to make the intervention. Please make your intervention brief. And if it is directed at one of our particular speakers, please do so. And now the floor is open for the discussion. Angela. Yes, Angela, you may unmute your button and go ahead, please. Professor Angela Little, everybody.
Okay, thank you very much. This is my icon was very much of a thumbs up rather than a hands up because I couldn't find the hands up. But I also want to say thumbs up. That was a very excellent array of presentations, extremely stimulating. I wanted to just move forward from something that Bela said and Gareth and Katia. Bela, I think, spoke about the need in the future to give more agency to students. Gareth spoke about the need to help students to learn how to learn and the need for more autonomous learning in the world in the future. And Katia gave us a very practical example of some of the students that she met who were working in classrooms where teachers were now giving so-called homework online. And this is definitely an innovation in England. I was also struck by several references to, on the one hand, digital media, and this was contrasted in many cases, I think, with traditional print media. Again, Bela did introduce the use of radio and TV as supplementary learning media. And I was just thinking, I was wondering, going forward, as we work our way into the next few years and at the same time remain mindful of the need to prepare for all kinds of emergencies, not just health emergencies, but also natural disasters. I wondered whether going forward, all new developments of learning materials using all of these different media might be made more learner friendly and more oriented towards autonomous learning, so that they could be used either in classrooms or in homes by students. So it's really asking whether we could take, as some of your speakers have mentioned, a dividend from this crisis and think in the future about developing learning materials that could almost be used wherever the child is or the young person is for their learning, to help them to learn how to learn and to be ready for learning as adults as they move into society and prepare for lifelong learning.
Thank you, Angela. I will ask Baila to initially respond to that. She's also had her hand raised, and thereafter I will direct the question to some of our other panelists if they want to add to that. Baila, would you like to unmute your mic, please?
Yes. So this is Bela. Thank you very much. You know, on this whole notion of student agency, learning how to learn, a lot of material, for example, that my organization has developed is on social emotional learning and life skills, using stories to be able to turn around the whole art of storytelling, engaging students with activities which are totally mapped to the curriculum, but are certainly far less stressful. They are on the tele school of the government. This has been done collaboratively with UNICEF and government. But there's so much more that's going up, but I really, both for the issue of how will a system adjust to these new interpretations of content development and management, but more importantly, whilst we've all talked, and that was my question on the issue of assessments and exams, we spoke about, through many presentations, about a revisit or resetting of assessment. Now that's a high stake conversation. And who are we really talking to? In very credentialed societies, who are we really talking to? Because that has taken the largest toll on students. I have a granddaughter sitting right next to me who's sitting and cramming her way because she has a final exam coming up next week. And she doesn't know really how she's going to ever make up for all those weeks and months lost. And the ministries, by the way, are fearing that they will be toppled in the next elections because they're not getting their act straight on the issue of examinations, online or face-to-face. The students are out on the streets at the tertiary level. And there are others who are writing anonymous letters, including my subversive granddaughter and her friends, that they will do this if they are given this examination because they have not really studied things the way they're meant to be. Who will actually, and you know, like emergencies are the biggest elephant in the room. We are still not confronting them when it comes to these three things: content development, where there's more student agency and preparing for the future, the pedagogy of all of that, including teacher preparation, and then finally the whole issue of assessments and examination. Really, it would be such a great conversation to see how we can elevate it in the coming weeks, because there are such important meetings globally that are being held. Some of our ministers and secretaries who are decision makers need to understand this better and how to tweak this conversation. This conversation is not going anywhere other than a kind of a paranoia by the ministry to say, and that's where the unstable policies come in. I love that term, saying the exams, you know, we've had 5 change of dates on assessments for matriculation examination. The kids are going crazy, and they've changed it yet again yesterday in Pakistan to another 4 weeks. So I think they're in a frenzy. There's a lot of pressure on every side. And we want to do what we call jugaadbazi, which means just sort of, it's a science of muddling through in management. and policies.
Thank you very much, Bela, for that. Can I invite Professor Oplatka to give a quick comment on that before I move on to two people who have raised their hands, Mr. Sokkanathan and Mr. Thanaraja?
There are many responses to this question, actually.
Make
but
it brief.
I personally, and I would like to focus on one of the questions, the written questions, because it connects to the vocal question. I'm among those educators or professors of education who believes that technology cannot substitute teaching or the teachers in the class. So when I'm asked about how to improve education by means of technology, I always respond by means of what? I mean, by means of empathy, by means of compassion, by means of sympathy, by means of enthusiasm. So this is something that I can respond to the teaching process of the. But if you want me to be more specific, I have to know about what.
Yeah, so the last point that Bela made about the governments taking decisions, it's not just unique to Pakistan. It's happening in Sri Lanka 24/7, one decision today, another decision tomorrow. Kids and teachers and parents are all in a frenzy. So I think we are all facing the same problem. So I'm going to a question that has been posed by Mr. Sokkanathan on chat, which says, what is the mechanism for institutional coordination for reopening schools? Successfully done perhaps in the UK out of the panelists we have, or is there anybody else who'd like to respond to that? A coordinated mechanism for reopening schools, successfully implemented during the pandemic. Katya, you want to take a jab at that?
Sorry, I have a toddler who was trying to distract me. Can you repeat the...
The question was about a coordinated approach and a mechanism for successful reopening. Through the UK experience, would you like to share some thoughts on that?
I think I personally, I know teachers and schools have felt very hardly done by the centralisation of decision making. It's been last minute at times, and it's been rushed, and often guidelines haven't been provided, but it's certainly from a systems perspective, having a strong centralisation in England. Remember, there's 4 different nations and the other ones have their own devolved ones, but the central UK government controls the English one. So that centralisation certainly has meant that it happens. It's the law. It becomes something that is contested, has been contested. I talked about lockdown 1, was contested at local levels, and the schools to some extent got around that by, making it very optional for students to come back. But no, that it was the law. And I guess, however, it has left the individual schools without that middle level that can often reinterpret. So the power of local authorities has been taken away by the marketisation of education in England through becoming academies. And so there's been, and the local authorities have little say in all of this. But yeah, it has its disadvantages, but that central decision making certainly means that it's been coordinated, even though it has been the consequences ad hoc at the local school level. However, schools have been vocal about providing that feedback back, and then there's been this, I think Professor Oplatka talked about, in a democracy, like, shouting back, and then things are changed again, which is unfortunate. But and I think there've been timelines where it has worked better, is where there have been kind of timelines, and the government has kind of stuck towards those timelines better. Where it hasn't is where it was more instant. I don't know if that helps.
Can I add something?
Yes, please.
The question should be more specific. I mean, if we are talking about reopening the system as a whole, So there is no question. The Ministry of Education has the responsibility to declare no more pandemic, like in Israel. But if we are in the middle of the crisis, and the crisis is there, we should adopt only a differential policy. And then our stakeholders or our colleagues will be the LEAs, the local education authorities, or the mayors themselves, the community leaders, be them some parents or religious leaders, I don't know, it depends on the community, and the school staff. I mean, and the school staff includes the psychologist of the school counselor, and the social workers, okay? If you have social workers in your school. So, because otherwise you won't be able to understand who is supposed to be in the school because this is a life matter, or who can stay at home because this is a healthy problem if they come. I believe in the centralization of the educational policy. I don't think that large-scale reform have ever succeeded in our world. They succeeded, but only as a marketing message, or okay, but not in real time.
Thank you, Mr. Abdakada. Mr. Thanraj?
Yeah. Thank you very much, and let me congratulate the Learn Asia for organizing this beautiful webinar, especially Sujata and Tara. It was very useful. We learned a lot of things about the international situation and how they are facing this pandemic. And my question is to Professor Platka. And it was a really beautiful presentation, Professor. And I want to know this, and we are about 70% of the population have been vaccinated. And I hear that you are very successfully facing the pandemic situation, especially in the field of education, if I'm right. And I want to know whether you have some special, I want to know whether there is a political behavior of the community, and especially the government political parties, government people and the opposition parties, whether they got united in facing this pandemic and fighting together. And you have been very successful. So can you share about this political behavior of your people and the political parties, especially the government party and the opposition party? How did they behave?
In Israel, the situation is different. It's not coalition versus opposition, but we are talking about different groups in terms of culture and society. For example, we have 4 major groups that are represented in 4 different educational systems. So this is something that taught me a lot, not about Israel, but about the constraints to devise a unified policy. Because, for example, we have the state education system that is very similar to the one in the United Kingdom, in the UK, in Germany, in the United States, in Canada, because it serves people who are, let's call them global people, secular people. And we have the state education, the religious state education that serves the more religious people, but not very religious people. And we have the system from ultra-Orthodox, and we have the system for Muslims and Christians. Now, it doesn't matter that Muslims can teach with my kids. Yeah, they are, and there are many. But the difference is that the Arab education system, everything is taught in Arabic. And in the Jewish education system, everything is taught in Hebrew. So it's a matter of cultural preservedness or cultural heritage. So parents are free to choose what kind of system they want their kids to study. But during the crisis, you could see the distinctions between these, not systems, but cultures. Because as long as more, let's call secular people, both in Muslim, Jewish, and Christians, met the regulations, their kids stayed at home, the more religious people say, no, we are not afraid of the pandemic because God is with us. So God is with us, we can send our kids to the school and nothing happened. And many things happened because the average of death, of corona deaths in their communities was much higher than in my community, okay? So, but the government couldn't control them, because if the government decided something that was against their cultural beliefs, cultural heritage, or institutional arrangements, They refuse to do that. And you can't send the police in a democratic country to every school. And you can't kill community leaders just because they decided to open their schools. So this is, and I'm happy to live in such a country. I wouldn't want to live in a country that the police is coming to kill the principals, okay? But this is the limitations when you are in a democracy that is consist of different groups. But this is also the situation, not more or less, but to a certain degree now in multicultural countries, okay? You can't control every school in your country. You can't control every classroom. We all know that when you close the door in your classroom as a teacher, I've been a school teacher for 7 years. So when I closed the door, I was the king in my realm. I didn't care what the principal has just told me in the staff room because I could give a personal meaning to my class. If he told me or she told me to do something, I could always say, yeah, I did it, but in my way. You know, Frank Sinatra, I did it my way. So this is education. So also in Israel, it's not a matter of coalition versus opposition, because no one from the opposition would resist closing a school if kids can die or parents can die. But community leaders are there. That's why in my book that published by Routledge in 2019, I emphasized the community. I called it reforming education in developing countries from neoliberalism to communitarianism. I said, you can't devise a global policy, education policy. Gareth, you said about global education. I'm sure everywhere you went was different in some sense. It's not the same. So that's what I'm talking about. So it doesn't matter of coalition, at least in Israel.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much for that very illustrative response. Silvina, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, here I am. Okay, well, first of all, I really appreciate all the presentations and all the questions. And I want to be a bit controversial here. Okay. So here I go. I think we heard different presentations with very different realities. I mean, I think the reality in Pakistan is very different from the reality in Sri Lanka and the reality in Argentina and in Israel and in England and all over. So I think if we want to think about future policies, we really need to focus on what we're gonna say for each of these countries. You can divide them in middle income, low income, high income. But for example, saying, as Gareth said, which I think it is very useful for some of the countries, that, okay, we need to focus on student needs. That means something very different when you're in Argentina. What do they need? They need food. So that's the need. Or that's, I mean, and I think you're focusing, I think it is very interesting, but you're focusing in developed countries. So I really think if we want to like build something different, to think about different realities, maybe we should start with a starting point, meaning we need all kids to be in school. That's one thing we really need. We need the state. We need the state. I mean, this idea of decentralization, I think it is very interesting. But if we can't guarantee the basic rights of the kids in education, decentralization has no meaning. What's the meaning of decentralization? That they don't access technology? Is that decentralization? Only the rich communities access to technology and the poor communities, they don't? So when we think about these words, I really recommend for all of us, or at least, I mean, it is something that I think we need to think about, is that this starting point with basic rights on education are warranted for all. And then we can talk about decentralization, about student needs, about many other things. But I mean, I think that we need to really rethink this macro policy for guarantee the basic rights to everyone. When we talk about exams, for example, I mean, I know that in developed countries, exams are, the students are pushed by exams, the teachers are pushed by exams, the schools are pushed by exams. But it doesn't mean the same in some countries as in Argentina, for example, in Latin America and many other countries in Latin America. So teachers, they don't care about exams. The exams does not mean anything. I mean, you don't have to pass an exam to get into the university. Universities has their own exams, international exams. The only word we hear when the results of like PISA appear in our countries is, we are a disaster. The students, they don't learn how to read and write, which is right. They don't learn. So we need to take care, maybe not in PISA, but in national exams, if they are prepared to improve education, not to not to put any any pressure on the teachers. But well, okay, my statement is, okay, let's be aware when we talk that we don't globalize, because the differences in between countries and regions are huge, and we need to guarantee with macro policy, with global policies, the basic rights to everyone, as for example, that when they talk about Pakistan, they said girls do not or go to school, but less than boys. So we need to think about policies for all girls and boys go to school. So thank you very much. Sorry for this maybe disruptive comment.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. These are real eye openers. One size fit all doesn't work globally. We have 192 countries. Thank you so much, Silvina. I'm going to invite Dr. Sujata Gamage, my colleague at EFSL, because we actually never got a chance of saying a few words about what's going on in Sri Lanka. So I'm hoping she'll do justice to that, as well as her own expert opinion on some of the things that were said. Sujata.
Thank you, Tara. So I think we have about 12 minutes, and I think that should be enough. 10 minutes, let's say. Yeah, in Sri Lanka, EFSL, we got into the Act from March, and we've been actually covering three things. Essentially, how do we get this attention on these kids who are off the radar? Because we've had to get the statistics, online education is happening, schools are closed, it's fine. The minister would say, but the statistics we were able to find that actually more than 50% of children are just not contacted at all. So that kind of work has been going on, how to give education to children who are offline. And the second is, how do we get them back to school? Then it's vaccinations and testing. And, Israel 70% vaccination in the population, but we are at least trying to prioritize the teachers and students. So that's the second one. And the third one is, when they get to school, the adjustment, diagnostics, and what they have learned. So this is really about, disaster management in a way. This is a slow burning disaster, and the last point in disasters is mitigation. How do we learn from all this and move forward, learn from this? So this is really, this session was about that. And I was so busy listening and writing, and it's been wonderful. So this is a fourth leg of what we want to do. And we really wanted to do a policy paper for the government on emergency preparedness. And I was actually wondering whether we could share it with our international colleagues. And there actually, I think I disagree a bit with Silvina. I would say one size does not fit all is not global. It's actually more countrywide. What we find is, what I really heard from Itzar and others is that, one of the key issues is how do we stop our ministers from trying to do too much? We have been really frustrated by our central ministry going on, but okay, exams we'll do, yes, we are going ahead, and then canceling and so on. To find that it's a universal phenomenon. All politicians are so similar and they all try to do too much. And I felt actually a little softer, a little kinder towards our ministry. It is in the nature of politicians, but let's please, in a chorus, let's say them, please calm down. You don't have to do everything. The teachers are fine. So I think, and the thing is, I think the decentralization issue is something we've been really focusing on. And I think I really liked when Silvina, because Silvina has been, Tara, I think I said enough about the local situation. I think, yeah. Silvina has been a secretary for the Buenos Aires province. And then I think she's a secretary for a city. I think this is amazing. Because in Sri Lanka, I can tell you a little bit about that. Education is technically from 88 to decentralized to the provinces. But unfortunately, we are really not using the provincial system. And it's at this point, I think that problem is showing when the central ministry is trying to do everything. And I was quite interested when she said, the city of Buenos Aires want to do hybrid and the province wants to do virtual schooling. And she won't have time to respond, but I think why not? Why not the city do something else? So I think really trusting the teachers, trusting the peripheries is something that I think a mindset change that is needed for emergency preparedness. The emergency preparedness, the ministry not trying to do that, that mindset change. No, trust the teachers. I think Katja took that, and also in Israel, we had this Israel Day actually under the radar, they brought the children to school, special education. We had so many cases in Sri Lanka too. Small schools actually thrived during, in a way, because they were able to get small groups of children, community-based schools, they work better. So I think future preparedness is really understanding that education, it's not something, I think globally there are a lot of similarities, I think, but locally, we really need to understand one size does not fit all and trust the peripheries. I think that is one of the best key emergency preparedness, I think I've always thought of, and I really got sort of, confirmation from across the world really today. So I think other one I think is really we're looking for emergency preparedness. What are things we could do? I think one thing is really how do we stop politicians from doing too much, and how do we trust the teachers? And what I really liked something Bayana said about social protection. How do we link that to education? I think in Pakistan, we have this social protection, and Sri Lanka, we have social protection network, which is not linked to the school system right now, and we are asking for that. We had school attendance committees in each Grama Nildari division. The Grama is a village, and they were supposed to look out for the kids and bring them to school. So I think we need to broaden that concept, and it's not about school attendance, has to be redefined. It doesn't matter where you are we connecting the teachers and the students? So I think people need to go around and check, have you talked to a teacher at least once a week? And I think we need that link that social protection to the schooling system. I think that's a really valuable thing I learned today. And I think I think I'll use the first name, mispronounce it. But I think, again, Katja also said, everybody, there's, and I think I've heard Gareth say that in another instance, we teach a lot of useless stuff in schools. So it's right now, we didn't notice that. We send the children to school, it's like a black box. They come out of school and we don't really micromanage. We don't try to see what's being taught. But right now it's coming into your phone. Gosh, do they need to know all this stuff, right? How to hold a button when you're doing a running, do you need to describe that in data? Why don't we just, do a runner relay? So we are beginning to realize how much useless stuff is being taught. So I think the pedagogical change, that the basic language and, and I think Gareth used the word the cumulative, you need this certain basic knowledge and you have to build on it. And I think emergency preparedness, I'm looking at a lot of soft things. I think just the understanding that there's basic stuff and other stuff has to be learned practically. And I think we talk the talk, but I think this COVID has made us really, you have to walk the talk. Otherwise, everybody's exhausted. And so much content, the reduction of content has become real. So I think that's another emergency preparedness as I see it. And I think I like the word evocative task. We need to give them, it's not the same task you give in school. It has to be evocative task. But I think of what I really differentiate, while I was saying three things, we need content development, teacher preparation, and assessment. But I think it was Angela who was talking about how do we develop content so that we use it when school is on and when school is off, when child is at home. Right now we have separated this. I think this blended learning, smooth transition from school-based to home-based. I remember when we went to school, there was a race, right? And we were told, okay, stop work, go home. And I remember I have this art book where I had just started to paint something and this is blotted. So I think we need to think of that situation. We should be prepared for that. The teacher should be able to say, okay, we covered this video today. Tomorrow it will be section 2 in that video, you watch it. And I'll call you and we'll check. You do the problem. So I think we need to think it through. This blended learning, I think, is a really key for emergency preparedness. I would go back to Sylvina. Actually, she came out with a nice list of things. Thank you for that. Actually, of course, the infrastructure, but I like the fact that you de-emphasize connectivity. I think that's very important because the telecom operators are not going to be putting up telecom towers all over. Connectivity is not going to, it's always the last 20%, 10% is going to cost a huge amount. So we really need to talk on offline content and devices. And digital literacy, I'm glad we touched on that. That's something we have not thought about. Everybody says they are digital citizens, and you sort of blew that myth. And thank you for that. I just been making notes, but I just want to, and of course, Gareth saying mental health more than education. So trusting teachers, I think, Tara, we have a amazing. I was wondering whether we can do emergency preparedness kind of paper, a little brief, whether it will fit the international scene. But I think it's amazing how similar we are, particularly, all these ministers running around like, knights on white horses trying to do things, and it's the same everywhere. So, and I think there's so much good stuff, and I think, but we will, Tara, I think should be able to do something, maybe the minutes of this, and do a briefing paper and hopefully share with everybody. And we may bother you to just, in an email, we might send you very short something and maybe give some comments but you've given enough today. So over to you, Tara. Thank you for all the panelists for all that amazing contextual information you have given. Thank you.
Thank you, Sujata. Before I just wind up, we are bang on 7 o'clock. I just want to ask Baela to make a small comment on what she had posted last on the chat regards raising the bar, number one, and also to make the key players, the global players in education, which are currently discussing, brainstorming on the same topic in different ways, like UNESCO, UNICEF, OECD, WEF, and so on, how to alert them, not just with this small group, but for a wider group, together with the Worldwide Commission that's focusing on education in kids or post-pandemic. Vaira, would you like to just give us quick summary of what you were trying to say in your chat message, please?
Well, I just think that the ministers and ministries, education systems, even decentralized ones, are under a lot of stress. They really don't know. There's an external face to it, and there's an internal face to it. And I do think that when it comes to examinations from grade 10 upwards, the pressure gets even more because of the credential aspect, credentialism in our societies and globally even. If we bring the global players in along with the local players, looking at sensible people in UIS, UNESCO, OECD, TIMSS, PISA, many of the countries are using already PISA for development, PISA, etc. ACER, and so many others, Cambridge education systems, IB, whatever. I think generally it will give that kind of sense of coherence and credibility and a kind of a sense that, all right, it is all right to not have this high stake frenzy on examination for this year and for next year. And then widen the conversation. Okay, if not, because, the story about assessment and exams then is the one that has ripples to what kind of content, what kind of pedagogy, what kind of teacher preparation. And I think if we are calling for a system reset, it has to begin with assessments and exam. Always must, now even more so. And I believe that people are ready to talk about it. And I think it'll be a big load off, people who are trying to do good in decision-making roles, but really don't know what to do. Hence, in all our countries, we've seen like 5 times assessment systems or examination dates shifting all the time. And, and when election times are coming, these are not good things. This is the political economy of education. We have to recognize, and I'd be very happy, and I think all of us in our own respective areas have good access to these bodies, where we can widen the system, calling in our national assessment boards, independent boards as well, to talk together. And I think it'll be a great conversation. No harm in having it. Once we bell that cat, I believe other things will become easier. This is my thought. And I think they're all accessible.
Thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful idea. Education Forum Sri Lanka will have an internal brainstorm on that brilliant winding up suggestion. I completely endorse and agree with it. Not only will we tap into the panelists who are with us today, we will also tap into the Worldwide Commission headed by Dr. Erwin Studin, and also widen our group, as Baila quite rightly said, make it a formidable force. And I'm sure it will become relevant and very, very interesting for the decision makers. I'm talking of the global bigwigs as well as the political leaders around the world. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are now 7:03. We take pride in generally stopping on time, and 7 o'clock was our stopping time. Once again, on behalf of Education Forum Sri Lanka, it's a big thank you for being with us. It was interesting, exciting, at times controversial, but certainly very, very provocative and stimulating in every way. This conversation. I am pretty sure this is not going to be the first and the last time we meet. So we look forward to your energy, your expertise, and your association with us in the coming months in not only discussing the COVID education crisis and the emergency preparedness, but beyond in terms of education globally. Thank you so much, everybody, and a good night from Colombo, but it's not the same in your time zones, I know.